Hello. Earlier, in the past month or two, I did a podcast on what beauty is. And today I'd like to talk rather of what the opposite might be, ugliness. And what this ties in with when we talk about body image problems and the obsession with beauty, especially in our country, and as pushed by Hollywood in particular. For consider, what woman isn't rather overly concerned in this country with her weight or other measures of beauty? And I'm reminded of various things I've read in dating books in the last couple years of how perhaps men shouldn't worry so much about feelings of inferiority up against a beautiful woman he might want to ask out for a date, because one or more dating experts has said that what these men don't realize is how much the women they so admire for beauty are inwardly worried about various blemishes of their own that they think are humongous sources of ugliness even. And this is something that the dating experts say men don't realize. Well, I'd like to examine what really is ugliness versus just a blemish, and why so many women might fuss about what you would just call a wart versus something much more serious. Well, I'd say in our culture we have an epidemic of what you might call narcissism, and Hollywood pushes this big time. So, for instance, what better way to feel number one, let's say, which I believe is a huge component of what you'd call narcissism, than to want to feel that your physical appearance is number one compared to other women. And so if you have any more wrinkles than everyone else, or your neck is too long, or your nose is too large, or you're too tall perhaps, or so you think, then I guess you're not number one, and this is sort of a narcissistic crisis then. I don't believe that this is really falling in line with what I would develop in this podcast to term ugliness. Rather, I would say what we're talking about in ugliness is either a physical trait that renders you basically very vulnerable to being pushed around, kicked around, bullied, etc., because you can't defend yourself with muscles and size. And you're also very vulnerable to injury if punched or kicked or hurt otherwise, compared to others of, let's say, medium body size and medium weight, and having at least some degree of muscles, like, say, in a man. We're talking basically mesomorphs here, as opposed to ectomorphs. And we're talking also the plight of those who are short, also being subject to being kicked around, because they can be. They're of smaller body size, and this is very problematic in a violent country like ours in particular. Now, the other form of ugliness I would talk about is something that I've run across from time to time in dating books and in a show put out by Wayne Dyer, the former psychology professor and lecturer, who came out with a blockbuster book, for instance, Pulling Your Own Strings. And at one point in that book, he talks of how almost everybody regards weak people as, I don't know, contemptuous in a way, or regards them contemptuously, doesn't like weak people. And he's not talking now of size and muscle strength. He's talking about having a lot of fear, basically. So I'm going to maintain that possibly those who have an extraordinary amount of fear of getting injured can manifest this in various ways, and it can be interpreted as a sign of weakness. Weakness to then compensate for this fear of being injured in certain ways. I could go into this in detail, how this happens, but that might be a better subject for another podcast. At any rate, then, I would recap right now to say, in my opinion, those we consider truly ugly are either those who can be kicked around because they may be either too frail, like an ectomorph, or too short, or they may be ugly in terms of being able to be kicked around because they're too fearful, and then what you might call compensating with submissiveness. And not only submissiveness in terms of will, but in how a person who is submissive looks at others with a sense of naivety, thus thinking everyone's perfect when they're not, because they're afraid of injury if they don't do so, so they become very submissive. I've talked of this at length in my video about being naive, what it means to be naive. In this respect, then, what really got me thinking about all of this was reading a couple years ago in dating books of all the women who are asked for dates by men they consider very nice, but they invariably turn these nice guys down for dates. Now, by nice, I would think everyone would agree highly empathetic, and the men think so of themselves too, perhaps, and are quite consternated, quite puzzled as to why they're turned down for dates so often by beautiful women. But what nobody seems to be saying is that these nice men are also very submissive men, I would say. Not just highly empathetic and loving, but naive, submissive, at the same time due to high levels of fear, in my mind typically from fear of being injured. They may have a slight body size, basically, either too tall or too short, that renders them very easy to injury, especially in cultures full of violence. So when they're getting turned down for dates, I would maintain they're getting turned down not because of their capacity to love being ignored in and of itself, but rather because a lot of women wouldn't want to date and possibly even marry someone who can't take care of themselves or help a spouse do so too, because they're very naive, very submissive. Hence the term nice. Nice meaning much more than kind and loving, but also naive, submissive, vulnerable to being pushed around by the words of others and any physical saber-rattling, if you will, any threats. And this is something that then can be regarded with contempt, actually, a big source of ugliness, if you will. So, to bring this into focus again, Some people, like many women, might regard ugliness as having simply a feature about themselves that doesn't allow them to think they're number one compared to other women. But we're not talking a feature, a body feature that renders them very susceptible to being injured in comparison to other women, are we? So, let's talk about men for a minute. I've ran into a video a year ago, for instance, by a man named Einzelganger in Europe, the Netherlands to be particular, who did an excellent video about 5 minutes worth in length on ugliness. This can probably be easily tracked down by searching on YouTube. Einzelganger, Einzelganger. He has pointed out to me in a personal communique that he has regarded himself as ugly because he's very short. Additionally, I watched a video by Tim Ferriss, who wrote The 4-Hour Work Week. And he did a video in 2018 detailing how he had endured much bullying as a child because he was very small in size due to being born prematurely. I've also been told by someone of a professor I know, or this person knew, who was short and had a lot of emotional difficulties because of it. And finally, there's a professor, Robert Reich, R-E-I-C-H, who produced, amongst other things, a documentary in 2013 entitled Inequity for All. And he's quite a promoter in the social justice circles. But note, it comes largely in his mind and in my mind too, because he's also very short. I'm not sure if you'd call him a midget, but very short. Now, in the opposite end, to be very tall, to be an ectomorph, not just tall but thin, I would say, is also to be subject to being pushed around, to be called a wimp, etc. And then, in my opinion, many of these people trying to compensate for this vulnerability physically by turning to the academic side as compensation. We may have heard the phrase, for instance, the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, if you would take that word pen and extend it to what's behind writing, and that is the intellect, and the sword to mean violent means, or let's say a lot of muscles or physical power, or the invulnerability to injury if punched, let's say, as compared to an ectomorph, then I would say that an ectomorph might typically turn to academics, and the favorite word then being a nerd, or even Spock from Star Trek. At any rate, a compensation for being vulnerable physically by taking up academics. And by academics I mean one of two things: either having a PhD or high degree that will get you a job and give you a lot of money and power and prestige, but maybe you may not have that much intellect under the belt. Or secondly, to really become a wunderkind, if you will, intellectually. Let's say a real techie who can really crunch numbers and do things with his mind. Hence the word nerd, as applied to those, I would say, who specialize in something and do it well, typically in a technical or financial arena, to gain power with their mind that they couldn't get physically or in other ways. There is, though, one other type of what you might call an ugly person. Let's talk about women who are highly obese in this country. Why most men might not want to date them unless they are also quite obese. Well, take for instance, going way back, perhaps in the 1300s, many wealthy aristocrats are said to have been obese. But they had no emotional problems about it. In fact, at that point in time, obesity was regarded as a sign of beauty, and a sign, too, that you had a lot of money to be able to afford that much amount of food to become obese in the first place. But today, I think no one feels that way. Why would that be? Well, I would maintain that these days, with all the cheap, low-calorie or low-nutrition, high-calorie food out there, called junk food, that food these days is typically used what you might call as a drug of choice, just as heroin or meth, to control anxiety. But note that when used by women, it typically, in my mind, involves anxiety caused by high trauma in their lives, often of a sexual nature. And they're then using food to compensate because it provides both a feeling of satiety, like after eating a huge meal at the Thanksgiving dinner and feeling so content, or because the obesity from all this food then helps to chase men away, which they unconsciously, I would say, love to do if they've had sexual trauma in their past. But what I would maintain garners the heavily obese woman the sense of revulsion in many men, deeming them ugly, is not their size, but rather the emotional package that comes with it. Basically, rage. That many or most obese women, in my opinion, are highly rageful women from abuse in the past that they're using food to compensate for. And that this then is something deemed ugly. Ugly meaning being around someone who has a sense of rage that might explode on you at any time. You might call some of these people then in the psychiatric circle borderliners. People who have a extreme volatility of moods. Now, I speak of all of this topic matter from personal experience too, big time, because I've had my own share of being considered ugly by way of the following. By way of being very tall, 6'3", and very thin too, especially when I was a youth. For instance, by the time I was about 12 or 13, my height must have really been shooting up there. And I remember we have a photograph somewhere in the house of me at age 12 sitting next to my pet dog, an Irish setter, on the front steps of a home, and I looked very emaciated. And having looked at this photo a couple years ago, I felt great revulsion when I looked at myself. It stimulated words like wimp and pathetic. Well, where did all this come from, and what was the impact of that? Well, I'd say, for starters, that I didn't consider myself a wimp or pathetic just because of how I looked, but rather because it made me so vulnerable to bullying. And what's more is the attitude of submission I took toward any bully. And that it's this submission that made me feel like a wimp and ugly. Not my body size, not the frailness. Not my having looked like I just stepped out of Auschwitz concentration camp. Admittedly, part of this frailty, I would say, came from my diet. For instance, something I don't know that I've ever admitted to my mother is that she used to pack up for me lunches made with sausages from Europe, high in fat content. I couldn't stand these sandwiches. And she would alternate them every other day with some kind of sausage that I liked better. And so the days she gave me the ones I hated, I would simply throw in the garbage. Additionally, I would get milk money to buy milk each day, but I would never buy milk because I didn't like milk either. And so essentially, every other day I went without lunch. And my breakfasts were nothing to write home about. So, dinner time, too, was not the greatest in terms of caloric intake. And finances were very tight in our household. My father having once, for instance, he never graduated from college. I mean high school. You would refer to this as a high school dropout. So, for a time, money was very short, and thus money for food. And when I would, as a teenager, ask for seconds at the dinner table, I was often chided or told we had to save the leftovers for yet another meal, or save the food for leftovers. And I might have been told sometimes, don't ask for seconds, you're gouging the food. Additionally, phrases like, you have a tapeworm, you eat too much. So, I turned to weightlifting, for instance, trying to build up my size as a teenager, but as an ectomorph, we all know that that's rather futile in many cases. I got a lot of strength compared to beforehand and tonality, but really no muscles. And my weight stayed the same, very low. So as a result, I found myself becoming very submissive due to this frailness. This looking like I just stepped out of Auschwitz, in part because I had so little caloric intake to include again, throwing away my lunch every other day at a minimum. So, I compensated for this sense of frailty in the following way. That one day when I was sitting in class in 3rd grade, I decided to myself that I was going to stop the bullying and sense of inferiority and vulnerability by becoming number one academically. And thus the phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword. I suppose I thought that I could outwit the bullies if I had better intellect, and also maybe become the teacher's pets and get their praise at any rate by being number one in terms of grades. Probably a combination of all of this. At any rate, I remember very distinctly that as an elementary school pupil, I would go to the library in the school at every opportunity I could and skim read one book after another. You might say I read the entire library, but that would be inaccurate, but I sure did read a lot of books, skim reading them, thus building up my mind incredibly. I would also do this with every public library I went to. And this proceeded throughout high school too, and even later on. Perusing libraries, collecting massive numbers of books at home too as the years went by. This even proceeded to the point where, in 2001, I stumbled across a software program called SuperMemo by a man in Poland, where it helps people become geniuses, he said, by spaced repetition learning, which is supposed to accelerate learning and do so in part by efficiently helping people review. So, as time went on, I plowed my time into this software program and stuck with it to the extent that I used it to review what it generates, electronic flashcards to store memory, knowledge, such that I estimate I generally spent 3 to 4 hours a day, 30 days out of each month, essentially missing only 1 day a month, for a grand total of 15 whole years. So we're talking 3 hours, 4 hours a day for 15 years, and I believe I essentially set the world's record on this. I had several email communiques with the developer of this software, back and forth between myself here in the United States and him in Poland, he being an English speaker. Now, all of this was my attempt, I believe, unconsciously and even more, to compensate for my frailty, my vulnerability basically to being pushed around. For instance, when I was, I'd say about 12, I was walking in the woods alone one day, and a group of boys came upon me. Bullying me, they tied me to a tree and then left. And after a period of time, it may have been a half an hour or several hours, they came back and untied me. Well, that was frightening enough in and of itself, but then it was cold out too. And coming back and untying me, they also muddied my clothing such that when I went back home, I felt so ashamed of having been bullied in this fashion that I secretly washed my clothing, my jacket in particular, in the basement laundry of our apartment complex building. Never told my parents what happened until, I'd say, only a few years ago, telling my mother. So ashamed I was of being submissive, if you will. Probably the only choice I had. But at any rate then, this submissiveness to bullies in this form and others being deemed ugliness in our society. And it all going back to how I then turned to academics to compensate for this vulnerability, not just of bullying, but to the extent of being tied up to a tree, essentially being kidnapped. And this, of course, wasn't the only form of bullying I experienced. At any rate, this drove me to push academically and intellectually, such that by the time I was 14, I was publishing articles in national journals, and in 1 year's time earned at least $500 to $1,000 in royalties, which in part, along with my stellar academic record, got me a $500,000 scholarship to a premier college and later studies in a technical and other discipline. But again, all of this as a compensation for what you might call ugliness. Naturally, unfortunately, this impacted my dating sphere tremendously, which is probably a subject for another podcast. Now, I once did a blog article a year ago on why some people develop what is called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, if you will, when subject to trauma, to include physical trauma. And other people do not suffer trauma from the same source of injury. To clarify, I have either friends or relatives who were once hit repeatedly and harshly by their fathers, call it beatings if you will. But because their physical size was such that they either were not easily subject to injury, or it wasn't very painful as a result, compared to an ectomorph. These people being mesomorphs, average physical size. Because of this, they were not traumatized by it to the extent that they couldn't develop careers, for instance, or get married if they wanted to. Whereas some other people, let's say women of arguably smaller size and strength in general, are said by the book PTSD for Dummies to be much more susceptible to PTSD developing because of their smaller size. They're more vulnerable to being pushed around, kicked around. And this is not just talked about by that book, PTSD for Dummies, and me, but even the comedian George Carlin in his 10-minute video on women, whereby he says women typically get kicked around because of their smaller size, and that if women were larger than men, it would be the opposite, he maintains. With humor, he says. So ironically, while psychologists and psychiatrists might maintain that there's a genetic component to PTSD, I would say by personal experience and reflection that a huge component of this is not some kind of brain disorder or problem with your synapses in your brain, in other words, your brain cells, but rather just the genetic influence on your size. We're talking influence then on women and their fact that they are women, and let's say whether you are tall or short. These all being factors then in how vulnerable you are to being injured by violent people. And that this then is the genetic component, the 95% of the genetic component of PTSD, not something awry in your brain cells per se. So, I brought up a lot of ideas, and they're not perfectly organized, but I think it makes sense to a lot of people if they would ponder it. And all of this is stimulated by personal experience to the max in myself, and by having watched various videos of others who struggle with the same thing, and by reading materials by life coaches on dating, and finally a book I read several years ago by a woman named Sabine Wilhelm, PhD, the book being entitled Feeling Good About the Way You Look, a program for overcoming body image problems. And while she's well-intentioned, I would say, and I believe out of Harvard and all, that she, in my opinion, misses the boat completely when discussing what some people call ugly, and others are simply dealing with a narcissistic problem of being number one. Ugliness, then, to recap, being, in my mind, an extreme vulnerability to violence, whereas a body image problem is basically just a matter of not being number one, because you may have a few more pimples or a feature of your body that's just a little bit smaller or a little bit larger, or maybe a wrinkle as you get older. But all of this not being a matter of how vulnerable you are to being pushed around because of your size, and then the implication it has on whether you become submissive or not, which is deemed another form of ugliness. I hope this is helpful to a number of people, because body image, I think, is a very big factor in our lives, especially here in America, and by way of how Hollywood impacts us. I would also say that it's been a huge factor in my life, because until recently in my life, I've taken my sense of inferiority because of my slight physical build to demean my other assets like high empathy level and intellect level whenever I'm around someone who is not frail. I've always deferred to them based on their not being frail, in other words, even if they were quite lacking compared to me in other areas, arguably very important areas. It's only been through much agony and suffering and study and thought that I think I've come out the other end on this body issue business and reclaim my life such that I can take my talents and apply them and offer them for a number of benefits in my life and others. Once again, I throw this out to those listening in the hope it will be helpful, and I think it probably would be. I wish you well.